Okay, and now episode 4 of the Illegitimate Scholar podcast. I always wanted to have 10 people listening to my podcast, and that's what I got. That's great. If you're this random guy from Belgium, unless that's somebody listening through a VPN, which I think is possible, but I don't know of one of my friends that's doing that. So if you're the guy from Belgium who's listened to all 3 episodes, please email me because I think that's awesome, and I want to hear your thoughts. And if you're anyone, and including my friends that are listening, I know a lot of you have texted me in person, and there's been a lot of encouragement, and I appreciate that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, and that's really why I'm doing this. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there, and I'm not doing this just for the end goal of growing a popular podcast. I'm doing this because I like interacting with this material and discussing these these types of topics. So today is going to, the last 3 have had a lot of overlap, and today it's going to be a little bit different. So unironic trigger warning here. This episode is going to have a lot of references to some pretty gruesome violence, some genocide and sexual assault. So if that's something that you're not interested in hearing in general or right now, I would shut this off right now. But the topic today is, what does it mean to lose a war? And I want to talk about a few different wars today and what the end of those wars was like for the people that won and lost the wars, and also like what the long-term effects of those wars were. And what we can think about in the future, because there will always be more wars, unfortunately. So here we go. Okay. So there's a quote that goes, 1 death is a tragedy and 1 million is a statistic. And it's been falsely attributed to Joseph Stalin a bunch of times, but really it doesn't matter where it's from. What matters is the context of what it's saying. And what it's saying is that, to me at least, when there's such mass death, there's mass death that comes with war and also from natural disasters and other things and disease. But when the death is so large, it takes away from what war is and how bad the things that happen in war are. Because, if 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. What that does is it dehumanizes it, because somebody looks at the number on a page that says 1 million, and they read that off, and they understand what 1 million is. They understand what 1 million is because they went to school, and they know they're tens, they're hundreds, they're thousands, they're 10,000s, and they know that 1 million is like a lot. Like, that's a fuckload of things. It's such a high amount of things that the human brain can't really comprehend that in the same way that it would smaller numbers. You can imagine kind of a dozen soccer balls. You could imagine maybe 100 soccer balls. You could probably do that. But, 1 million soccer balls, what does that mean? There's no evolutionary principle that would require human beings to think about a number like that. It wouldn't help us survive. So our brain doesn't process it in the same way. And that's true of a lot of things. A lot of things, there are evolutionary explanations from the past when we were evolving as primates for a very long time for why we do certain things. And a lot of times the disconnect that we have as humans from our world, in my opinion, comes from the fact that we didn't evolve to live in a world like this. Technology is changing so quickly that our bodies are not able to adapt to living in this different world. It's very similar to what I've talked about before with how the human environment changing drastically. Like, culture can deal with certain aspects of this, but culture needs time to grow as well. It doesn't take as much time as evolution, but culture can help deal with these things. But again, it takes generations for culture to grow. And when technology is changing so quickly, it's outpacing the pace at which culture can change. It's too big of changes in culture too quickly, and that's tough for people. People have a hard time with change, and it's only with new generations coming in that things become acceptable. But I'm getting off topic. So what we're going to talk about today is war and what it means to lose a war. So, really, like I'm saying, what I want to discuss first before I get into this is that human death is a tragedy. Everybody has their loved ones that they know, and war is something that it takes, the numbers are unfathomable to humans, like I'm saying, but that means that the horror of war, the experience, is unfathomable because of how bad it is. People die from natural disasters and things like that, but acts of God like that are not preventable. But it feels like wars are preventable. In a lot of ways, the wheels of history turn, and no single person is in control of these situations. So things are kind of going to happen how they are. But I think that creating a society, creating a culture that is against war because we understand how bad war is a very important thing to do. And our society has done that. If you look over time, over the past few thousand years, it goes up and down, but people are less likely today on average to experience a violent death than almost any other time in history. And if you look at more traditional societies like those in Papua New Guinea, there even amongst hunter-gatherers, there is quite a bit more violence. And I'm going to talk about in the future the effect of having a state society that is well believed in. I say that relatively, but in the West, there's this thing called the what's it called? The force. It's something of force. It's the consolidation of force, the centralization of force. So this is basically how the UN, I think, and I should have looked this up before, but I didn't, and I'm on a roll. So the person who's in control of a country is kind of the one who has centralized the ability to commit violence. And when I'm talking about committing violence, it's not just actual violence, but like the threat of violence, and that can be legitimate violence. Legitimate violence is like violence done by a police officer. I mean, as long as they're within the rules of law for arresting someone. Arresting someone is violence. You're taking away their liberty, but sometimes we live in a society, and the social contract is an agreement that like we live under certain laws. So somebody has to be allowed to commit violence in that way to protect us from murders and things like that. And there's obviously more to it than that, and there can be issues, but that's something I'm going to talk about in the future. But today we're going to talk about war and what the loss of a war means. And I've been going on about this already, but I just, the reason that I'm thinking about this is because of what I've seen recently with the talk of nuclear war with Russia, and how horrified I am about this, because it seems like it's been long enough that people are forgetting what it's like to have the prospect of like a lot of people in your community suffering and dying at a mass scale from something like this. There was the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, but I think it was around 7,000, 8,000 troops, and Vietnam was like 66,000. Korea was in the 50,000s as well. And World War II was a few 100,000 in the United States and many more in other countries. So there is a chance, and people don't think about it like this, but there is a chance that a lot of people in our lifetimes will enter into something like World War III. And I don't think there's no way that people, including myself, but there's no way that people understand how deadly that could be. I mean, there's a possibility of millions of Americans being killed, and millions of Americans, it's an unfathomable number, but that pain stretches far beyond just that one person. I remember growing up, and I wasn't allowed to mention war in general. I wasn't allowed to get certain things, and I had to be very careful talking about war or talking about anything in front of my grandmother, because my grandmother's brother died in World War II, and she never got over it, even into her 90s. I still wasn't allowed to bring it up. And I know that the pain that she carried her entire life, that pain is amplified amongst so many people in Europe Asia, Africa, anywhere, Latin America, anywhere that war has happened, you can think about how much pain there is that comes out of that, where people had loved ones that they don't get to see anymore. And it's unfathomable to the point that it's unacceptable for that to be accepted. And we should be doing everything we can to stop something like that from happening. And so one way I want to put it before I start, because really now I've gone on for 10 and a half minutes about this, but somebody can live their whole life. A person grows up, they have parents, they have friends and family, and they live until they're, 18, 19, 20 years old. In some cases in World War II, they were 15, 16-year-old kids. And it could be one artillery shell or one tank shell or one bullet, but you could take out 80 people that lived their entire life, 18 years, and each of them affected dozens of people in a positive way who wanted them around. And in just one strike, 80 lives are silenced. And the reverberation of hurt that comes out of that is a net loss for humanity that just can't be understated. So I've gone a little bit into how losses in war have historically been catastrophic, like the personal impact of a single person dying, and then how that's amplified across hundreds of thousands or thousands of people. That's one thing, but there are a lot of situations in world history. For most of world history, a lot of war was in effect genocide. Genocide was kind of the standard for human civilization for a long time, unless a people was large enough that it was kind of impossible to wipe them out. Most of the time, a people group in like a chieftain stage, they would, if they only have a few thousand people in a town and there's an empire next door, they're probably going to come in and they're going to take them over, and they would only leave them alive to live as subjects of the empire. And sometimes that works okay. It works out okay for certain people, but it doesn't always. It's one group of people instilling their will over another group of people, and that can come out with benefits for a subject people, and they can eventually work their way up in a lot of cases, as happened in Gaul in the Roman Empire, and there were a lot of places that were helped by the Persian Empire. And people make these arguments a lot, but ultimately I think what these miss is that when an empire enforces its will over subject people, the path of the subject people is taken from them, and their values are going to be changed, because if they are in a positive situation, it's going to be that they just happen to be in a positive situation. They're not in control of their own destiny. And the people of that community are not in full control of the choices of that community. So in other times, what could happen is the entire people could be murdered. They could, well, not murdered, that's a crime. It's a state violence, so it's legitimized. They could just come in and they could kill everybody. What's more common, because people are worth money as either slaves or peasants, is they could be taken as slaves and sold somewhere else, or they could be turned into peasants that are not a free class either. I mean, they're basically slaves. They're slaves to the land instead of just slaves to an individual that's traded around. But their lives are similar in a lot of ways. It depends on where and at what time period, but there are certain places where lives of slaves were better than the lives of a serf, especially given the types of jobs that they might be required to do. But neither of them are free. And it's just, there could be mass rapes. This was legitimized by, this was very, very common. In Chronicles of Genghis Khan, there are lots of times where in the writing it says, and he made her his wife, which just means rape. And there's not really the same concept of consent back then as we have today, but it was considered legitimate. Make him his wife because they won the battle, and they had legitimized sexual assault, because if they win the battle, part of the fruits of the labor is the women. The people of a place would belong to the invading army, and they are at their will. And this was the reality of warfare for a long time, for a very long time. And what this led to is the complete destruction of a lot of different cultures, and some of them that have very little people left. And some of these cultures, they exist in part, but sometimes they're just completely gone. I mean, when you read a history book, you can see like there are names that don't exist anymore. And sometimes that's because the people there chose a new name in the future, but sometimes it's because those people were essentially wiped out and assimilated, and many of them killed. I mean, the Assyrians is a good example, and the Assyrians were actually basically wiped out because of how cruel they were to the people around them, that eventually it came back to them. But I don't know if committing genocide even excuses genocide being put onto somebody, because often it's subsequent generations that had not, like with the Assyrians had committed genocide on many people, but then subsequent generations of Assyrians are then getting that same treatment, and those individuals, none of them alive, had even done anything to those people, and I don't think I'm comfortable with accepting a people being genocided simply because they had committed their own crimes. I don't think that's the way to create a more peaceful world. So that brings me to what the point of a war is. It's to dictate your will to your enemies. It's expanding your own country's interests at the expense of someone else. And it might not be at the expense of someone else, but the point is that in a war, the winner is dictating to the enemy how things are going to go afterwards. And often in history, most of the time, that was very, very bad for the people that were defeated. And when you think about this, now, you know what? I'm going to say, I'm going to give a few more examples. So Europe was originally, the first humans in Europe were the Neanderthals. And those people, they lived in, again, I'm going to do a full episode on this. I mentioned them before. They were the original people in Europe. They really were. And they were displaced by Homo sapiens that came in. And then ultimately, that wave of Homo sapiens was almost entirely displaced by a new wave of Homo sapiens called the Indo-Europeans. And the Indo-Europeans, that includes the Celts. And the Celts, and they now live in Galicia in Spain, Brittany, Cornwall, Brittany in France, Cornwall in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the Isle of Man. But the Celts they had taken over all the old people except for Basque country in Spain. Basque country is the only group large group. I think there's some other smaller group, but they're the largest one that predates Indo-European. There's some examples like in Finland and Hungary of people that came even later that were not Indo-European or pre-Indo-European. They're from Asia. But the Basques are the largest group and the most formal one that predates the Indo-Europeans. And then again, like I said, the Celts came, but now they're just in the fringes of Europe, and the Indo-Europeans, then replace them. So there's been two full waves in Europe of new groups coming in and replacing the old ones. And that comes with it an incredible amount of cultural destruction. And the same thing, and of human suffering. And the same thing happened in Latin America with European colonization. It was that they were replaced. So my point is ultimately that war is bad, and I've talked about this for way too long, but war is terrible. And why I wanted to write this was because of the chance of going into World War III. So I don't think anyone spent a lot of time thinking about how bad it would be. And like I said, we cannot fathom how bad it would be. It's too much for the human brain to truly process. So what I want to talk about now is how wars winning is a spectrum. So there's a spectrum. And, you can have different metrics to decide how this is, but completely winning a war is not the same thing as slightly winning a war. And how badly one group defeats the enemy and their specific goals will dictate how serious of a victory it is. And there can basically be draws in a war, like in the Korean War. Just basically split the country right down the middle, called it a ceasefire. I'm going to call that a draw. And people's goals can be different for a war. They might not be mutually exclusive, so two people can consider themselves having won a war if it comes to that. But North and South Korea, the Korean War, seems to me like it was a pretty good draw. And then there's wars where, like, there's times in Mongol invasions when the Mongols came up to a city, the city had insulted the Khan by killing an emissary possibly, and then Genghis Khan would come in, and he did this multiple times, raze the city to the ground, kill most or all of the inhabitants, and enslave the rest. And if you were a Mongol slave, you did not have a long shelf life. You were going to die very soon, likely. And that would be a total victory. And there can be slight victories as well, and there can be, it's a spectrum. There's not just win or lose. It's not a binary. And another reason that there might be an issue with winning a war, like a country might want to have a complete victory, but someone else, like other powers, they'll check that. These things are often called coalition wars. If somebody's getting too aggressive, and anybody who plays Paradox games knows, like in Europa Universalis 4, if you're trying to take over the world and you take over territory too quickly, you'll have a punitive coalition war, and a bunch of other powers will decide that you're too big for your britches, and they're going to come in and stop you because they don't want you to. And this happened with Napoleon. Napoleon got way too powerful, and France was going around taking everybody over. So basically all the other powers came together to stop him, and it took a bunch of tries, but they eventually got it. And the same thing happened with Japan. Japan tried to take a bunch of territory from Russia and some Chinese warlords, and the European powers said, no, you can't have that much, because they didn't want Japan to expand. But what I'm going to talk about is the War of 1812, because I think this is a good example that Americans know about a lot, and Canadians and North Americans. I think the West knows about this war a lot of times because it's I think it's a common meme on the internet that, the Canadians, well, really it was the British, but the Canadians, when like they're talking about this, they'll bring up that they burned down the White House, which Canadian militia and British troops did do that. So Washington, D.C. does get burned down. But the reason I bring that up is that just the Capitol was burned down, which seems like it would be a huge win for a war. But it doesn't happen like that. The Capitol gets burned down, but America still, the United States, still achieves its war goal. The British could have possibly taken America back over. They could have taken the United States back under the British Empire. That could be considered a pretty total loss, because it would have been the destruction of the then current experiment of the United States. But instead, the United States was able to get what it wanted out of winning the war. So even though the United States Capitol was burned down, you could call that war a win. And often people bring up the burning of the White House, but they don't say that we lost the War of 1812, because the war goals, which were to get the British to stop impressing, which is to say, it's a fancy word for naval enslavement. They would press you into service in the British Navy, and they were taking American sailors, merchant sailors, and they were putting them in the British Army, and they were essentially trying to enforce the claim that these sailors were British citizens. They were not recognizing them as American citizens. And after this war, the impressment really stopped, mostly, and that led to a lot of recognition of the United States. So even though the Capitol was burned down, which seems like it would lead to a very bad loss, that's not the case. America does okay out of that war. It is an integral part of the American story and how America gets stronger. And also the Canadian, whatever it's called at that time, the Dominion of Canada or whatever it was, their capital in Toronto was burned down too. So, well, 1 for 1. Canuck fucks. Okay. Just kidding, Canada. I love you. So, America still exists after that. It's not a total loss. Now I'm going to talk about Vietnam, which is another one that, this is one where the war happens far away from American shores. And it really is a mostly 20th century invention to have wars that aren't existing at your border. For most of human history, it didn't make sense to go to war with somebody that was far away. Only in situations where there were extensive trade routes, so your effective territory, if you consider your trade ships like the Romans would have as basically part of their territory, if they're being attacked far away, and you might have colonies that are close to that as well, then that is basically war coming to your shores. But in the case of Vietnam, there's no Vietnamese troops that ever land on American shores. So this is a lot. Like a lot of people will call it a loss, and it kind of was. If you consider the goal taking over Vietnam for capitalism in the first world, and that it became communist, then yeah, it's a loss. But at the same time, it wasn't a loss in the way that Germany lost World War I. Like, the Vietnamese were only able to dictate the terms of what would become the status quo for Vietnam. They were not able to, for example, ask that the Americans cede California to Vietnam. And that would be unthinkable for them to ask. And they weren't capable of doing that. This was a contextual win for the Vietnamese, for the North Vietnamese, as they destroyed the South Vietnamese government and they took over the entire landmass. And the South Vietnamese government functionally ceased to exist, and American troops were removed from Vietnam entirely. And I think there was some monetary compensation. But past that, there wasn't. The Vietnamese knew that this victory was in the context of Vietnam, and that limited the types of things that could be asked for and would be given in a peace treaty. And that's important. It's a very important distinction. And it's not because I care about if America lost a war or not. That's not what this is about. This is because I'm scared of the potential of America truly losing a war. And people might think that the end of a war would mean a continuation of American life in the way that the loss of war in Vietnam did. And, there was a cultural reckoning because of the loss in Vietnam and the amount of American lives lost, and maybe a loss of legitimacy overseas because of that war. But there wasn't a destruction of American life in the way that the enemy who had defeated us in war is able to, for example, dictate school curriculum, which is one thing that's happened in a lot of cases when someone wins a war. I mean, that's a lot of what imperialism is. Like, can you imagine what people can do? And there are plenty of examples of this when they get to decide what your children, which is the future, get to learn. And there are a lot of examples of this on a not war level, but on like just inside the United States, like a political level. But I digress. So I want to talk about Germany and World War I. And I'm going to talk about this briefly, at least relatively briefly. Germany and World War I is often like what happens after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, and as Versailles, doesn't matter. The British and the French wanted, and others as well, they wanted these very punitive damages collected. from Germany for their part in the war. And I'm not going to go into the specifics. You can look them up if you want to. These things really depressed Germany, and it led to a lot of issues with a lot of people. They owed a lot of money. There was a lot of personal sorrow, a lot of people dying, a lot of women going into prostitution, and this is because these things that these demands for money, and this was more of a total loss. They didn't kill all the German people, but they were dictating the economy of Germany to a point of destroying the will of the people. And this made a lot of people understandably very angry, and it eventually, in a lot of ways, does lead to the breakout of World War II. And this is important, and a lot of people, if they don't know too much about this, they're probably confused right now, so maybe I should expand a little bit more. But I'm going to do an episode in the future on how people respond when there are bad times, and how there's a proportionate response, and how things like this increase the likelihood for regime changes, and in the case of extreme situations, extreme regime changes in order to fix the problem that they perceive. And this is where, in my opinion, things like fascism come from, things like communism. In Russia, the communist revolution. In China, in Russia, the communist revolution comes out of this horrible environment where the people are treated very, very poorly by the Tsar, by the king in Russia. And it's hard to look at the situation and how long it had persisted and how people were being treated and be surprised that there is this communist uprising. In the same way that in China, and we're going to go into this in the future because the opium wars are a thing, and there is a lot to be learned about China and about even modern China from these opium wars and the long history of China, and why that eventually and the Japanese invasion of China, and why that eventually leads to Red China, to Mao taking over China. And in the same way, the conditions in Germany, it's not all that much of a surprise that this leads to this very, very is an understatement, this extreme ideology of the Nazis and what that leads to. I mean, we know what that leads to. It leads to the Holocaust. It leads to mass invasions. It leads to the possibility of, the Holocaust could have killed many, many more homosexuals and Jews and disabled people and Catholic priests and all the people that it killed. But his plans, Hitler and his cabinet's plans, had he taken Moscow and defeated the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is no spring chicken. They're not very nice guys over there. The genocide that could have and was planned to be placed upon the Slavs would have been, without bar, the most destructive loss of life in human history. Because if they could have successfully taken everything over, they would have killed hundreds of millions, likely, at least tens and tens of millions, but many, many more. So these things are very serious. And I'm going to expand another episode on how these extreme situations lead to extreme human actions. But today, I'm thinking about dehumanization because I've seen a lot of people discussing the war between Ukraine and Russia, and there is a lot of what I've seen dehumanization of Russian soldiers by calling them orcs, and other things that I've seen. And I understand the anger, and I feel the anger about this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But I also know that when I see that, I know that there are Russian people on that other side who are forced into the position that they're in. And, if your sons are off fighting, if your daughters are off fighting, then, and men and women in your community are doing this fighting and the suffering, it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong. It's you're going to be on your team, and when your team is your people and you're playing with your lives, it's going to create a bad situation where extreme things like mass murder in the form of genocide are going to become acceptable as the intensity level of the atrocities committed ramps up naturally, as there's tit for tat. There used to be like Hatfields and McCoys clans fighting. Well, wars between nations are just a larger version of that. So I hope I've made it a little bit known that these situations where people, where there's extreme sorrow inflicted on a community, how that can possibly make these horrible things like the Holocaust seem acceptable. So now I want to connect this today. After World War I, there was World War II, and things seemed to go okay for a while after that. I mean, there was the Cold War, obviously, between the West and the Soviet Union, and things kind of calmed down. There wasn't as much of the hot violence. But then we see the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, and that dire situation, like earlier ones, like the situation in Germany after World War I, like the situation of the serfs in imperialist white Russia, the situation leads to something very bad, and there's ethnic cleansing going on in the Balkans. And it leads to this situation in Russia where a lot of people are worse off. In other countries of the Eastern Bloc, like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Belarus, these places are in trouble. And this is one of those situations where more drastic things become possible. So now what I'm seeing in 2022 as American power has, and when I say American, I really mean Western, has continued to push east and more countries join NATO, it has created a worse and worse situation for Russia and Russia's people. And, sanctions on these countries that most Americans, and, frankly, myself included, consider our enemies, these sanctions have the effect of also emboldening the people and making their situation much worse, which in turn creates a situation of acceptability for perhaps more extreme actions. And that's how Putin is able to invade Ukraine and stay in power. And I'm sure a lot of Russians don't support the war, but enough of them do, and enough of the people in the right situations do. And regardless, the situation in Russia right now was created out of the death of the Soviet Union and the coinciding creation of a new global order with the Western states overcoming Russia. And so this could, in turn, lead to World War III. And that's really ultimately what this whole thing comes down to, is that we're in a situation where they're talking about use of nuclear weapons on national TV again. When I was growing up, we had terrorist threats and things like that, and that was like what we dealt with. But all I would hear about, and I was born in the mid-90s, all I would hear about is the stories of how everybody during the 70s and 80s and 60s, they thought they were going to die in a nuclear blast. They thought it was only a matter of time. And I just kind of thought like you might have been scared of terrorist attacks, but even a terrorist attack, as scary as it is, it's not going to, unless the terrorist attack is done with a nuke, which has never happened before. You consider state-sponsored terrorism bombing, which there's an argument there, but the threat of nuclear war was really the threat of the destruction of all of world civilization and probably the death of 99% of the human population. And that wasn't really on the table for most of my life. And that was nice. And I don't think that was lost on most of us that were born in the 90s or the early 2000s, because everybody that we knew that was older than us had lived through a time where they were expecting to die from this nuclear bomb, and most of us were reminded often about, because it was so recent, this Cold War era, and now it's been long enough that a lot of the population doesn't remember those things, myself included. They don't remember living with the threat of nuclear war, and I just hope that there isn't a situation where nuclear bombs become acceptable to use. And I also hope that even if nuclear bombs do get dropped and a lot of people die, and there isn't a situation where it causes nuclear fallout and everyone dies first somehow. I don't really see how that would even happen, but I guess it's plausible, especially since there's only been one use of them on large human targets. But the possibility of a destruction of our country in a war, the possibility of a total loss of war with or without nukes, where there are Chinese or Iranian or freaking North Korean, Russian, of some country that is anti-American, that is our enemy for some plausible reason, from some understandable reason or not, when I just hope that there isn't a time in my life where the United States loses a war, and loses a war for real. Not a Vietnam or War of 1812, but, Germany in World War II or World War I, where they come in and they march down to the Lincoln Memorial, like that famous picture of the Nazis marching under the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. They march up to the Lincoln Memorial, and they destroy the George Washington Monument, and they raise whatever their flag is at the White House, and they completely subdue our military, and all of our officers relinquish their commands, and the U.S. military is dismantled. And people don't consider that a possibility because the United States, it's never happened. It's never happened. Yes, we lost Vietnam, sure, but it's not the type of loss that would lead to the complete destruction of our country. And there is no memory in the United States of losing a war. There just isn't. It exists in the French memory of the Franco-Prussian War, and that played a huge part in World War I, and how punitive the French wanted to be to the Germans because of how severe the Franco-Prussian War loss was to them. In the United Kingdom, the last time they really think about that, and the people in charge were the political and literal descendants of the Normans who did the conquering, but there isn't a memory of anybody losing a war in England, in England. I guess that the Irish have a pretty huge memory of it, but since 1066, was that 1066, the Norman conquest, and then prior to that, it's the Anglo-Saxon conquest, which is shortly, I think, the 400s. So, and China with the Opium Wars, and the Japanese in the 1940s. I mean, the Chinese get defeated by the Japanese, and then the Japanese get defeated by the Americans, and there's a history of that in that country. But Americans don't have that. Canadians don't have that. Australians don't have that. New Zealanders don't have that. And the British one is so ancient that it just doesn't compute. Russia sort of has it because of what happened in World War II with this massive loss of life, but they eventually won the war. But, in the War of 1812, not that many Americans died. In World War II, so many Russians died. So many, tens of millions of Russians died. And wars have always been away from our shores. No one's invaded the United States besides a few Japanese bombers and like a Mexican bandito in like the 1800s or something. No one's invaded America in a huge way since 1812. It just hasn't happened. Not even an invasion. And that invasion wasn't that bad. It isn't in our memory. And we've been detached from war so long because it happens away from our shores. And some men and women die, and a lot of people are untouched by it, and they don't put things like that on the news anymore, and so much of it is done by special ops, special forces, and I see the writing on the wall of the possibility of the United States losing a war, and whoever we lose to, it could be 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, it might be the European Union if some horrible rift happens. I doubt it, but the European Union could come under the control of some other entity that is then hostile to the United States. It's impossible to see right now because there would have to be so many changes leading up to that, but stranger things have happened, and because people tend to believe that things that have happened are going to continue to happen, there isn't this idea of this possibility of this happening in the United States. It's not a worry because there's no reference to it. And I keep saying the same thing in different ways, but I think this message needs to sink in more because I didn't spend a lot of time talking about this or thinking about this, and I've been surprised by how people view the possibility of war. And it took reading a lot of different books and about what happens when countries lose wars, both in the 20th century and far before. But there is a possibility that after some conditions are forced on the American people, that creates a situation where America has some sort of Nazi-like destruction of their culture. I mean, I hope it's not going to happen. And some people would argue that, American treatment of certain groups is Nazi-like. But we've been so prosperous for so long, and American lives have improved from generation to generation for so long, and that isn't true anymore at all. That in itself is not true. And I think that it's very possible that the next few decades of our lives, of the people that are listening, if they're in their 20s, their teens, their 30s, that we're sitting and experiencing the decline of an empire. And collectively, some people may be individually aware of what sort of damage this can do to people. The collective won't understand it in the way that other countries understand it until it actually happens to us. And while it might not be in our lifetime, I think it's possible it is, but it will happen eventually. That's how time goes. I mean, just like people, political entities have their rises and their times and their falls and sometimes their rebirths, but whether it's 10, 20, 1,000, it might be 1,000,000. It's not going to be 1,000,000, but it could be. It's going to happen eventually. Okay, so that was a happy episode. I'm going to try to set up a Discord and a Reddit and stuff like that. I'm slowly building these things. I'd love to have other people discuss this and have an easy place to say something to me and let me know how much you hate it and how I'm bad at talking and how I jump all over the place. Let me know whatever you think. While I try to go by the advice of, if you have nothing good to say something, say nothing at all. In this case, I crave interaction so much that if you just come on to tell me how much I suck, I'm actually going to be quite happy with it. So please do. All right. I will see you.